Good morning, Tarkiln. It's really good to be able to speak to you this morning. I'm speaking to you in the summer holidays, and it's been a really strange year, as many of you know. And for those of you that don't, I'm a head teacher of a school, and it's been a very strange year. It's been quite a difficult year. You know, we've been hearing on the news that we have to make plans to get children out of school to begin with and back into school and all this, that and the other. And the whole of our, well, since about March, all I've been doing is making plans, trying to implement plans, trying to keep people safe, all this, that and the other. So it's been a really interesting year. So we've got to the summer holidays now, and I guess we can try and plan for September, I suppose. But what I found really strange is, in amongst all of that really unusual stuff, and people say unprecedented stuff, I had loads of normal things to do as well. So, for example, you know, in amongst all of that, I still had to set the school budget for the next year. I still had to make sure there were some interviews that I ran. There was loads of stuff that I still had to do that I would normally do, in amongst all the stuff that was unusual. And one of the things I had to do to try and get ready for September, one of the normal things I would have to do, is run some interviews for the head students, people that were going to be on the head student team for the next year. And so in the last week, I quickly squeezed in those interviews. And they're really great times. You get to speak to these young people who are ambitious. They want to have a role in the school. And I love those days, because you don't always get the chance to speak to young people like that in the school, in my role. So, put time aside, interviewed all these young people, and then went from there. And one of the questions that I ask on the interview is, who is your biggest inspiration? Now, clearly, the right answer is to say me, because I'm the one asking the question, and I'm the one potentially giving them the role. So if you sat there in an interview situation and you're saying to someone like, who's your biggest inspiration, you know, there's a really clear answer. Now, I have to say, in all years of doing that, no one's ever said that. So I'm just going to have to put up with that, I'm afraid. But the most common answer to that question that I ask of these young people is their parents. They often say that their parents have been the biggest inspiration. The best example for them to follow is looking up to their parents. And I think that's really interesting, because today's talk is about Jesus the example. We're looking at Jesus to be our example, our inspiration, our role model that we look for, to try and lead the best lives as possible. But yet, like those young people that I interview, sometimes the examples we have in front of us that we understand the most and have the biggest influence on us are the parental relationships, either from us looking at our parents, or maybe for those of us that have children, trying to set examples for our children. And the good thing is that while we understand that, we come to a God who calls himself our Father. We come to a God this morning that tries to describe his relationship with Jesus as a father-son relationship. And so, just like those young people in those interviews that say that their example is their parents, for us, it kind of is as well, but it's our heavenly parent. We're looking to Jesus as an example, as we would do in a parent-child relationship as well. And that's how I want to approach this morning, is to try and keep on bringing it back to what would I be, what would I want to take on from the challenge of this talk as a parent, as a child, that kind of thing. So I hope what I have to say is helpful. I know I'm not a biblical scholar, but I have a bit of time and my mind wanders around things, and I'll share a few thoughts. And if those thoughts are helpful, then that's great. So I hope they are. So let's read the Bible passage together that we were given for today. As we come to look at Jesus, our example, the passage that I've been asked to speak on is from the book of Matthew, and it's chapter 16, looking at verses 24 to 28. Some of these verses are actually quite hard to get a head round. They're not easy to read. The first bit says that we have to deny ourselves, take up our cross and follow him. That's a tricky one to try and get a head around, that one. What does that actually mean? Another one says that we should, or further down in that passage, actually says that whoever wants to save their life will lose it. Again, that's a very hard thing to try and get a head around. And it finishes by saying each of us will be rewarded by what we've done. Now, that last one in particular, let's start with that one. We cannot think that Christianity is something that we have to do to get rewarded for. You know, we talk about accepting grace and accepting forgiveness. It's not about what we've done. It's about what Jesus has done. And we have to read this passage today in the light of knowing that as well. We can't do anything to earn God's favour, God's love, God's forgiveness. That comes freely. But I guess what this is saying is, having received that, let's try and see what that looks like in action. And that's why we look at Jesus as our example. Someone who walked this planet, walked this earth, and did so in a way that we can follow the example of what he did. It says there, whoever wants to save their life will lose it. And I guess, to me, I think what that is saying is that if we just try and do stuff, if we just try and follow an example, if we just try and do the right thing all the time, say the right thing, then hopefully that will work for us. It doesn't really work like that either. We can't do this ourselves, but we need to do something in response to what we've done. And if you have a look at that first bit, deny yourself, take up your cross and follow me. You can often read that and think, well, that sounds really, really heavy actually. Take up your cross and follow me. What does that actually mean? Well, we shouldn't take it literally. Christianity would not have been around for this long if everyone took up their cross literally and followed in Jesus' footsteps. It wouldn't take long to eradicate all the Christians in the world by doing that. It's not meaning that, but what it is saying is that this is going to be costly. If we are going to follow Jesus and follow his example, follow his lead, be inspired by what he's done, then yes, it is going to change us. It's going to be costly. It's going to affect us in some way. A very easy example is if we feel the need to give somebody money because they are struggling, because it might be to a charity, it could be because of financial difficulty for that person, that will cost us personally. You can't help someone financially without it costing you personally. And I think that's what Jesus is saying in the bigger context. We can't follow his example. We can't do things for other people without it affecting us. What we have to do as Christians is put ourselves to one side, deny ourselves, and then pick up that example and follow him. And that doesn't mean picking up your cross literally and following him to be crucified somewhere, of course not. But what it does mean is that if we are to follow his lead, if we are to follow his example, then it will be something that will be quite difficult at times. It will cost us personally. And there are lots and lots of examples. If I come back to that parental example, there are so many examples as a parent where we can say it does mean that we don't deny ourselves something because we're trying to set an example and do things for our children. There's no point in looking at the financial cost of having a child. Of course there's things that we put aside. We might put aside careers for a while. We might put aside the sort of things that we can do. Our social life certainly changes. Why? Because we've got children. Things change. And I guess you can look at that as being costly, but you can also look at it as an act of love. That we're doing things because it is the right thing to do, and we're setting that example in our own little family lives. And that's what God's asking us to do. That put yourself aside. It's not all about what we want. It's not about what we are trying to achieve as individuals. Actually, it's about looking at others, seeing where the need is, putting ourselves to one side and realising, yes, it might cost us a little bit this. It might affect us a little bit. We might not get everything that we want out of this. But that's Jesus' example. And I just want to spend a bit of time now just thinking about some of those examples that Jesus did actually set. Things that might be useful for us to think about, particularly in today's context. And to think, do you know what, I'm going to follow his example. I'm going to follow his lead. Because what he did while he was on his earth was exactly that. Set us that example so we could follow that. So let's try and keep that in mind. We can't earn salvation. We can't do things to get rewards, but there is a response to accepting his forgiveness that we heard about last week that affects us personally, puts ourselves to one side, and that follows his lead. And let's just see where this goes. So let's have a think about what we saw in the way that Jesus led his life that makes us recognise how he put himself to one side and did things for other people. And let's try and think about how we could put that into action. One old song from when I was young was, "You laid aside your majesty, gave up everything for me." And I guess those words are coming back in my mind quite a lot. What did he actually put aside? How did he deny himself for us to then follow his lead? Well, he invested in relationships. When you invest in relationships, it does cost you. It does take something of yourself. And you can see that in the way that when Jesus turned up to see his friend Lazarus and find out the news that actually he had died, he wept. He felt sorrow. It hurt him. He invested in relationships and it cost him. If you think about his reputation, the reputation and the expectations of others on Jesus, and he put them to one side. And he spoke to a woman at a well with a really bad reputation in her local area, someone of Jesus' background he should never have spoken to, but he did. And he put aside his reputation and he spoke to someone who perhaps society would have frowned upon. He invited a tax collector round for tea. And people must have thought, what on earth are you doing? But he put aside those expectations, he put aside his reputation, and he communicated and spent time with people that society didn't want to. He was known as the friend of sinners. What a great name to be known by. But he denied himself and took up his cross, and that's the example we need to follow. He gave his time. Whenever you give time to someone, you're never going to get it back. It is a way of denying yourself. You think of the time that he took to restore Peter on the beach after he denied him 3 times. He gave his time for that. He gave his time to go and visit the house of a stranger whose daughter was unwell. He gave time to that. What an example to lead. That's the example that I want. He welcomed children. And again, society would have said, don't waste your time on children. But he did. He gave his time. Look at the patience that he showed. People, when they didn't believe, he was patient with them. What a great example. That's the sort of example that I want to lead for my own children. That's what I want to give to them. Think how compassionate he was. He saw hungry people and he made sure they were fed. He saw people that were hurt and injured, and maybe some people that were even disabled at times, and he had compassion on people and he responded. He gave of himself, he denied himself, he put himself to one side, and he was compassionate in what he did. He was caring for other people, even to the point where he wanted to make sure, even when he was on the cross, he wanted to make sure his mum was okay. And when you care for people, you don't get that back again. Not always. But he denied himself, and that is the example that he gave. And probably the best example that I can give you as well of how Jesus led his life for us to follow is through forgiveness. When you forgive someone, it can hurt. It can take something of yourself, but look at what he did. He showed forgiveness, and those are the kinds of things that have come to my mind when I've been thinking about this. That's the sort of example that I want to lead. That's the sort of the direction I want to follow. Not just for me, but so my children can see me doing that as well. Something that I need to put in place that takes away from what I want, what I need, and gives that time, that patience, everything else to other people. So for me, here is the challenge, and also the difficulty. We may be thinking, yeah, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to use Jesus as my example, and I'm going to try and follow it. The trouble with that is, he's the perfect example. You know, my kids might see an example in me, but they'll also see my flaws. They'll also see things that I don't get right. When we look to Jesus as an example, we don't see that. We see a perfect example. And if we set that as our goal from a talk like this, to then think, right, that is what I'm going to do, we are going to trip up and fall. When that happens, come back to forgiveness. Whenever I do something wrong in my own little family, it is important, I think, for my children to see me acknowledge that. That's a good example for me to set, I believe. So when we actually try to use Jesus as our example to try and follow, and it goes a little bit wrong, just come back to that forgiveness. Come and acknowledge that before him and start again. But what I think is the right way to move forward is to maybe consider in your own lives one or two aspects of Jesus' example to try and follow in small steps. And I would suggest that one of those is actually forgiveness as well. I think that's huge. So I would really try and encourage that. So it may be that you think that giving time to other people is something that you want to try and follow Jesus' example in. Then do it. Just try and do something. If it's about showing compassion to other people, then just try that. If it's about being patient with some people, then do that. If it's about trying to show love to other people, then try and do that in some way. But don't try and do everything, because we will end up tripping up. But maybe pick one or two things and just try and work on them and ask God to help you to follow that example, follow Jesus' example in those things. We sing a song at our church that has a line, show me how to love like you have loved me. Those are really hard-hitting words, they really are. But that's what this is about. It's about trying to love others as God has loved us. We're trying to follow the example that he has set so that others can see that as well. And that's hard. But as I said, this is about small steps. One or two things. Bring them before God and ask for his help in that. But follow Jesus leading them. Put yourself to one side and follow his lead and see what happens. And then maybe a little while later, just try and think of another couple of things. Put yourself to one side and follow his lead. And by doing that, I think we'll get closer to our own Saviour. I think we'll know him more, but we'll also demonstrate what that is in our own lives to other people that are around us. So those are my thoughts. I hope they've made sense in some way. And thank you ever so much for listening so far. Thank you. Bye-bye.